All right, welcome back everyone to chapter 23. And we're going to be looking at the second part of respiratory physiology today. So, here we go. Time to learn some more cool stuff in the world of Bio 153. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground throughout this chapter. And the big emphasis that we're going to be focusing on here now is looking at overall the transportation of gases that go through the blood, the respiratory system. And we've mentioned already through Dalton's law that these gases are actually partial pressures of the gases themselves, right? So we're not breathing in 100% oxygen. It's actually in the air, it's 20.9% oxygen. So we first are going to focus in on the different methods and how oxygen is transported in the blood. So oxygen transport. So oxygen is going to be carried in the blood through two major methods. So one, we can see here, number one, oxygen can be dissolved in the plasma of the blood, and that percentage is 1.5%. The number one method and how oxygen is carried in the blood, you can see here number two, 98.5% of oxygen is going to be loosely bound to hemoglobin. So those are the two major methods and how oxygen is carried in the blood. So these two right here. So definitely important to know those two major methods on how oxygen is carried in the blood, and the percentages here, of course. Well, we're also looking here, we have two terms referring to is the oxygen bounded to the hemoglobin or not. So oxyhemoglobin is referring to the effect that the oxygen is still bounded to hemoglobin, the idea of oxyhemoglobin. However, here we're looking at the term called deoxyhemoglobin, and that is when hemoglobin here that has released the oxygen. So the oxygen has been disconnected, let loose from the hemoglobin. So that gives you an idea of transport. So when the oxygen is being transported through the blood, it's attached to the hemoglobin. And then when it finally gets to tissue cells, then it's released to the tissues. So important to know the two major methods and how oxygen is going to be carried in the blood. And we can see here once again, 1.5% of oxygen is dissolved in plasma, and 98.5% of oxygen is bounded to hemoglobin. So we're now going to take a look at a very important curve, which is known as the oxygen-hemoglobin dissociation curve. And this is a S-shaped type of curve, known as a sigmoid type of curve. And it gives you an idea ultimately of the percentage of oxygen that's connected to hemoglobin. And that's referring to the saturation. If we were to look at the axes, our x-axis down here is looking at the partial pressure of oxygen that we would find at particular areas in the body. And then our y-axis for the graph is the percentage of the saturation of hemoglobin. So the amount of oxygen actually bounded to the hemoglobin. So at the top of the curve, approximately right about here, we can see that this point on the graph, indicated by the arrow, that there's a 98% percentage here. So hemoglobin, 98% is saturated with oxygen, referring to that amount of oxygen bounded to hemoglobin. So that's the case very early on when we consider the oxygen going through the blood at the level of the lungs. However, that percentage will change. So when you get to this point on the graph here we're at a point of saturation of 75% with oxygen, hemoglobin with oxygen, 75% saturation. So this would be the level at resting tissues, as you do need some oxygen to go to resting tissues throughout the body when we think of tissues in the muscles. So you might be wondering, well, Chris, how do we come up with the saturation level of 75%? To come up with that percentage, you actually would go from this point in the graph, and if you were to go ahead and follow that over here, eventually you'd hit this line right here, and that would be 75%. This graph here is in increments of 10. So here's 0 on the graph. So 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, and here's 75. Okay? So then you just follow that over horizontally till you hit the curve here on the graph. And hence you end up with a 75% saturation level. Now, to come up with your partial pressure of oxygen, you would actually follow this dotted line down vertically to eventually you hit the x-axis and you would end up with 40 here. So 40 is the level of the partial pressure of oxygen right here on the graph. If you were to go back up to 98% saturation, you'd follow that down vertically and you get a partial pressure of probably more along the lines of maybe 94, 95% there. Now, if you were to go do lots of exercise, aerobic activity, there's going to be more of a demand for more oxygen to be disconnected from hemoglobin. And you might be down right here on the graph where we're looking at hemoglobin saturation at 25% now, 25% saturation. So right there on the graph. So that percentage goes down as more oxygen will disconnect from the hemoglobin. So that's the case here if we're looking at exercising. So a lot of those tissues in your legs and your arms that you're going to be utilizing if you're running 3 miles on a treadmill or if you're going out to run 5 miles on a trail in the woods. So 25% saturation now. So a lot more oxygen disconnected from the hemoglobin and going to those tissues. There's the demand for these tissues in your muscles to do the endurance-related exercise. So that gives you an idea of the term affinity, referring to the binding strength of hemoglobin to oxygen. So this gives you an idea of a normal type of curve that you'd have when we're looking at the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. Again, looking at the amount of oxygen saturated bounded to hemoglobin. The level will always be higher up at the level of the lungs, opposed to farther in the body when we get to exercising tissues. All right, we're now going to take a look at various factors which can influence the hemoglobin saturation. And there's various factors that can play a big role when it comes to the rate of loading or unloading of oxygen And this is going to be regulated by several different components. Number one is the partial pressure of oxygen. How much oxygen do we have available? Do we still have a lot? Have we lost a lot? So that's a big one right there. Another big influence in ultimately probably changing the curve is body temperature. Is somebody's body temperature increasing? Is it declining? Number three, blood pH. So that's another factor. Is the blood becoming more acidic? Is the blood becoming more basic? And then we have number four here, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. What are the levels of carbon dioxide gas in the body? Is it low? Is it higher? That can play a role with the rate of loading and unloading of oxygen. And that will influence the curve. And the number five we may not be as familiar with, which is looking at the concentration of BPG. And BPG is an abbreviation for 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate. And this is a substrate that we find in glycolysis when we think of aerobic cellular respiration. This is produced by red blood cells during the breakdown of glucose. So these are all various items here, these factors which can influence the curve. And we'll see how that takes place here when we look at the next graph. All right. So we're still on this idea of the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. And we're looking at how the curve changes and is influenced. So we take a look here and see how this can change. And we're going to have clinical examples, and this will help us to understand the shifting of the curve. So our first clinical example of how the curve is going to be moving, in this case, shifted off to the left here as our focus. We look at someone that might do really, really strong, rigorous aerobic exercise, such as running a half marathon or running a marathon. So running a half marathon is no easy task. That is 13.1 miles. So you're literally out there running maybe for an hour and a half straight if you're very fast, or maybe 2 hours or 3 hours or maybe 4 hours. So when you're doing something that strong of an endurance-related exercise, like running, but it could be swimming or biking or something along those lines, there's going to be a huge demand for oxygen to be unloaded from the hemoglobin to the tissues of the body. You're doing aerobic exercise. It requires oxygen. So we look at how the variables are influenced. So the curve being shifted to the right, a big factor here is the fact that body temperature will increase. So body temperature increases when you're exercising, right? So you might start at the starting line and it's 30 degrees and you're cold and you're all bundled up. But you have to consider when you start getting those muscles toned, body temperature is going to go up. You're going to start to sweat. You're going to get warm. So you never want to overdress. So body temp goes up. You start to get warm. So we consider that on the graph. So this is normal body temperature, 38 Celsius. Okay. So the curve being shifted to the right is this idea right here that we're going from this like pink curve to this purple. This would be the normal line right here that I'm showing you. Okay, so I can illustrate that here. This is your normal curve right here that shows 38 Celsius. But that's shifted to the right now. When you're doing that aerobic activity, you're getting warm, right? Body temperature's going up some. So that can play a big role ultimately. So you can see that shifting in the curve here that's taking place, represented here on the graph, going more towards 43. Not that you'll actually reach that level, but that body temperature is going up. Another thing that's going to happen over time is the fact that your levels of carbon dioxide is going to increase. So the partial pressure of carbon dioxide gas is going to increase over time as well. That's going to be represented on our graph over here. So the middle line here is representing the normal curve. And once again, we look at the idea that the curve is being shifted off to the right. So this middle line here is showing your normal levels of arterial carbon dioxide. And ultimately, those levels can increase over time doing aerobic activity. So we can see this illustrated here on the graph. So ultimately now we're going to end up more on this curve here. So the curves get shifted more to the right over here, going from maybe the pink to the purple here. And we can kind of see that illustrated here. Okay. Now, of course, this is taking place an increase in CO2 because over time with your muscles, if you're out there for a long period of time of endurance, sometimes you can have lactic acid buildup that can take place. And you can run out of oxygen debt sometimes. And oxygen levels might go down slightly because more and more CO2 is being built up in the body. So it's very possible that CO2 levels can ultimately go up. And that's because there could be some decrease in oxygen levels. And so reaching oxygen debt sometimes can happen where you might hit a wall doing that strenuous activity, especially if you're doing a marathon. And if you're running a marathon, it's double a half, so it's actually 26.2 miles. So you might be out there running for 3 hours or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7. You might be out there for a while. So you might just get tired, but maybe you've been training and you won't. But you're out there going for a run and you got your new shoes on and you're ready to go, right? So CO2 levels can increase over time. Maybe you're starting to run out of oxygen. Another thing that can happen is I mentioned lactic acid. Well, your pH falls. That can happen over time. The pH can decline. So likewise, that's the same ordeal here with this graph. So pH is falling in the individual, and the muscles ultimately are feeling more of a cramping or burning sensation, and that's the resultant of the pH of the blood going down slightly. And so I've been there before. It can be a very painful experience. Sometimes you're hobbling to get across the finish line because of the severe cramping up of the legs. They just don't want to go anymore. So definitely not a fun experience for sure. And then another item that can happen is an increase in production of BPG, because ultimately you're going through doing aerobic cellular respiration when you're running the half marathon or the marathon. And so you are going through glycolysis and ultimately ATP. And the food that you're putting into your body is going ahead and charging aerobic cellular respiration. And so there can be an increase in the substrate being produced and ATP generation taking place. So very important to key in on these variables. How are these variables being influenced with a change in this curve? And again, the big thing here is the effect that our curve here is shifted off to the right. That will happen when you do rigorous aerobic exercise. Body temperature increases when you're moving. And likewise, an increase in carbon dioxide can start to occur, using up a lot of that oxygen for the tissues for the aerobic activity. And over time, sometimes pH can fall too. Again, a buildup of lactic acid can occur, the pH falling. And with that, when doing aerobic cellular respiration, you can have an increase in this critical substrate here, BPG. We now look at the complete opposite effect of how our oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve is affected. This time, it's looking at the curve is now shifted off to the left. So the curve is now being shifted off to the left. Our case study example here is someone that is swimming in Lake Superior. And maybe they're swimming and they realized it was a little colder than they thought. You know, the month of May is probably not a good time to go swimming in Lake Superior. It's the coldest of the Great Lakes up near the UP in Canada. Or maybe it's fall and you're out kayaking along the Pictured Rocks from Munising up to Grand Marais. Maybe you fall out of your kayak and you're in freezing cold water and you're freaking out, you're spazzing out, and your anxiety's off the charts and you're hyperventilating. So, how does the body respond to the situation of being in this really cold water? Remember that the normal line here is right here with 38C. That's your normal line for the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. And so the impact of the curve shifted off to the left now, no longer the right, the left. So going more towards 20C, not that your body temp would reach that, but 20C here. So that's the case. Body temperature is falling slightly. The oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve is being shifted off to the left. Okay, being shifted off to the left here. Going from 38C more towards the direction of 20. We also now look at the impact at our other graph we have here. Okay, so here we look at the impact where you have your normal line in the middle here, kind of a pink per se, and you're moving off towards the left to the blue line. So that's going to involve ultimately a decrease in carbon dioxide, gas CO2, and an actual increase in pH. So we look at this scenario here, a decrease in CO2, and this is going to happen when someone is hyperventilating for sure. Because when you hyperventilate during an anxiety attack, okay, you're spazzing out, you're freaking out, oh my gosh, the end of the world is here, ah! Well, your inhalation is less than your exhalation, the way you're breathing when you're hyperventilating. And you're exhaling so fast that you're losing so much CO2. And so you're taking more oxygen in than CO2. And so your breathing is way off, right? Where you might just be breathing normally, inhale, exhale, whoo, inhale, exhale, whoo. But now it's more along the lines of this short inhale and quicker exhale. And that's literally the feeling you're having being in that cold water sensation. So a big decline in CO2 and carbon dioxide. Now what also happens is a change in your blood pH. Your pH becomes more alkaline. Your pH becomes more basic. And we can see that here on the chart too, where you start with normal arterial blood of 7.4, and you might be getting more along the lines of pH of 7.6. So that can definitely take place. And this is kind of a condition of an acid-base state known as the respiratory alkalosis, which takes place here, respiratory alkalosis. And again, you can see the CO2 like we mentioned, normally like a 40 millimeters of mercury and declining to 20 here. The other thing which can happen is a decline in your BPG levels, that critical substrate in aerobic cellular respiration. As the cold water is probably playing an impact, maybe early on, but you're probably getting colder, body temp is going down, you're probably not moving as much. And that all plays a big role with less oxygen being released from the hemoglobin. When we think of oxygen, and we look here at hemoglobin affinity being increased. Okay, so again, we'll wrap up here. When someone is in cold water, they're experiencing hyperventilation, maybe a bad anxiety attack, panic attack occurring. In that cold water, of course, body temperature is declining, the curve being shifted off to the left here, going from 38 more towards the 20. And then this graph here represents the changes in your carbon dioxide and your pH. Again, you'd start in the middle line here and going towards the blue line being shifted to the left. So an increase in pH from 7.4 to 7.6, and carbon dioxide gas being more along the lines of 40 millimeters of mercury and more towards 20, with also a decline in BPG levels. Okay, so very important to make sure to review the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve, be aware of the factors that can influence the curve, and definitely important to know how these variables change when the curve is shifted to the right or the left. So very critical to review this information for sure. All right, getting back to the transportation of gases, we're now going to take a look at the methods and how carbon dioxide gas is transported in the blood. So, there are several different ways. Number one, 7 to 10% of carbon dioxide is going to be dissolved in the plasma of the blood. Okay? 7 to 10% of CO2 is dissolved in the plasma of the blood when we think of, again, CO2 transport. So that is one method. Number two, 20% of carbon dioxide gas will be bonded to the overall portion, the globin portion of the hemoglobin. So when CO2 combines with hemoglobin, it's now defined as carb-aminohemoglobin. So that's one method how CO2 is transported. 20% of CO2 will bind to hemoglobin, forming this relationship. So that's the second method here. And then the majority of carbon dioxide, 70%, is going to be transformed and transported as bicarbonate ions in the plasma of the blood. Okay? So that is a major method of how CO2 is transported. 70% of carbon dioxide gas will be transported as bicarbonate ions in the plasma in the blood. And those are the three major methods. Now you might be wondering, well, how does carbon dioxide gas become bicarbonate? We take a look at this formula down here because it's all about buffers, okay? And this is actually a nice example of more along the lines of the sodium bicarbonate buffering system. But we'll get more into that when we get to our chemistry chapter in the weeks to come. So we start with, you have carbon dioxide gas, so CO2, and that will combine with water. When that happens, then you form H2CO3. This is known as carbonic acid. This is a weak acid, okay? A weak acid, carbonic acid. What allows for carbon dioxide to combine with water and really help that chemical reaction is the assistance of the enzyme carbonic anhydrase. Carbonic anhydrase. And this enzyme helps to assist with the reaction because, again, when we look at enzymes, enzymes are defined as a biological catalyst that can speed up a chemical reaction and ultimately forming products. So that enzyme helps the reaction of CO2 and water to form carbonic acid. So we have a weak acid, but we're not there yet. So what needs to occur is you need to lose a hydrogen ion from this. So you have a hydrogen ion that will come off, and that's the case right here. So the hydrogen ion will actually come off the carbonic acid, okay? And then what will happen then is you now have formed bicarbonate, okay? So now we have bicarbonate. So that is HCO3. HCO3. It's the bicarbonate ion. And that is a base, a weak base, by the way. Now, this entire reaction, believe it or not, is actually taking place on the red blood cell. This is taking place on the RBC, okay? So literally I could draw that, and literally this entire equation, this chemical reaction, is taking place on a red blood cell here, okay? So that's my red blood cell down here. So pretty cool looking, right? So that's your RBC right there. So we have the bicarbonate on here, right? The HCO3 bicarbonate. But in order for it to travel in the blood, the bicarbonate actually will move off the red blood cell and will move into the actual plasma of the blood. So then it's going to be out here for actual transport in the body. And that's how bicarbonate, that's where it's going to be traveling. Again, this is a major method of how CO2 is moved in the blood, is in the plasma. The whole chemical reaction occurs on the red blood cell. But for transportation in the body, the bicarbonate moves in the plasma of the blood. And it moves off because of what's known as the chloride shift, which we'll take a look at here very shortly. But this reaction can, yes, go one way, but it can also go the other way. It's reversible. It just depends upon the type of respiration that's occurring. Are we looking at external respiration? Are we looking at internal respiration? So that plays a major role. So it's possible then for bicarbonate then to leave the plasma, come onto the red blood cell when it's time to convert back to CO2. And then literally, now you're back where you started. You have the bicarbonate back in the red blood cell. This is a reversible reaction. So I can erase this and kind of show you here that. So I'll erase this and show you here once again. We looked at first forming CO2. Oh, we started with CO2 and we had to form bicarbonate, but now we're going to do this totally in reverse. All right, so now we have our bicarbonate. And we're on the red blood cell. We need to turn the bicarbonate back into a weak acid, carbonic acid. So in order to do that, again, there'll be a hydrogen ion that will come into play here. And this hydrogen ion will go ahead and attach to the bicarbonate. So this is the hydrogen ion here we're referring to. And then ultimately, you have your weak acid here, your carbonic acid. This is all taking place in the red blood cell, by the way. So H2CO3, carbonic acid, is a weak acid. And then it's a matter of this weak acid needs to be broken down. So this is broken down by the important enzyme, the carbonic anhydrase. And then ultimately you have your water and your carbon dioxide. And there you have it. You have your CO2 right there, right on the red blood cell. And then eventually, of course, with CO2, we got to get rid of it. So simple diffusion can take that gas and can ultimately take it. And so it can be transported from pulmonary capillaries to the alveolus and then gone through exhalation. All right. So those are the three major ways and how CO2 is transported in the body. So make sure you know the transport methods and the percentages. All right, we're now going to look at visuals to see these methods of transport and exchange of carbon dioxide gas and oxygen. And this is looking at the movement of these gases when we look at external respiration. Okay, external respiration. So that's occurring between an alveolus, again, very small microscopic structures within the lung tissue, along with movement of the gases between pulmonary capillaries. The red arrows that you see here represent the movement of oxygen gas. The blue arrows represent the movement of carbon dioxide gas. Okay? And the thickness of the arrow represents major methods and how the gases move. So let's look at, how about oxygen first? So this big arrow here represents the movement of oxygen, and ultimately the major method here is the oxygen binds with hemoglobin. This is being represented right here. Okay, and this is a preferred method. Again, 98.5% of oxygen will take this route and will be combined with hemoglobin. So really forming oxyhemoglobin here. The other route is oxygen transported from the alveolus to the pulmonary capillaries and oxygen dissolved in plasma. Again, not a whole lot of oxygen will take this route, but roughly it's 1.5%. So not a whole lot. All right, carbon dioxide. So a small percentage of carbon dioxide will be dissolved in the plasma of the blood. That percentage is roughly 7 to 10%, I should say. So 7 to 10%. We'll use that method. And we can fix this here a little bit for you. There we go. So 7 to 10% we'll use this method of transport for carbon dioxide. Number 2, you will have roughly 20% of CO2 on the red blood cell. That's combined with hemoglobin. Again, that's known as carb-aminohemoglobin. And eventually then it becomes disconnected from hemoglobin right on the red blood cell. And so that method there of choice is roughly 20%. And then the major method of CO2 is that it moves as the bicarbonate ion in the plasma. So here we have the bicarbonate right here, HCO3. It's in the plasma of the blood. Okay, right? Plasma of the blood. And so what happens then, because we got to form this as CO2, the chloride shift will take place. That's the way the bicarbonate can be transported. So bicarbonate comes on the red blood cell, and this is in exchange for a chloride ion that comes off. So here we have the bicarbonate right here, right? That weak base. And there'll be a hydrogen ion that can combine here. And ultimately then we are forming our weak acid right here, H2CO3, which is again called carbonic acid. This is the enzyme, the critical enzyme right here, the carbonic anhydrase. This will help to break down our weak acid into water and CO2. And then that CO2 can leave the red blood cell through simple diffusion and enter into the alveolus. This is the preferred route of CO2, being transported as the bicarbonate ion in plasma. 70% of carbon dioxide gas will use this transport method. Okay, once again, this image, we can see the movement of CO2 gas and oxygen gas. But instead of it being external respiration, now the emphasis is looking at internal respiration. So this is happening at the level of your tissue cells. So internal respiration occurs between tissue cells of the body and systemic capillaries. So again, we look at the movement, the exchanging of our major gases, CO2 and oxygen here. So looking at oxygen once again, here we have the oxygen right here, and it's time for it to be loaded to the tissues. So hemoglobin with the oxygen, the overall oxyhemoglobin. So now the oxygen disconnects from the hemoglobin, and ultimately it travels to the tissue cells. Again, this preferred method here is 98.5%, major method. The other oxygen gas dissolved in the plasma of the blood will go ahead through simple diffusion and go to the tissue cells. And that preferred method is 1.5%. Okay? And then we have our CO2 gas represented by the arrows here in the blue. CO2 leaving the tissue cells, going to the systemic capillaries. So dissolved in plasma, again, that percentage of CO2 will be 7 to 10%. We'll use this method. And then we have 20% of CO2, 20% here. This is a second. There we go. So 20% of carbon dioxide gas will leave the tissue cells, will go onto the red blood cell. CO2 will combine with hemoglobin and ultimately forming the carb aminohemoglobin. And so as that combining and making that structure, that is going to be 20% of CO2 that goes that route. And then finally, 70% of carbon dioxide gas, preferred method, the CO2 will be transformed into bicarbonate, that weak base. So CO2, again, will combine with water. That will be assisted by the enzyme carbonic anhydrase to form our weak acid right here, H2CO3, carbonic acid. You will have a hydrogen ion that breaks off, dissociates, and comes off. And you're left now with HCO3, your bicarbonate, your weak base. And then the weak base, your bicarbonate ion, will come off the red blood cell to the blood plasma for transport. It's able to do that because of the chloride shift, which allows for the chloride ion to leave the plasma of the blood and go to the red blood cell. So now we can see our three major methods of CO2 transport in the body and two major methods of how oxygen is transported at the body, and also looking at the two forms of respiration: external respiration occurring between the alveolus and pulmonary capillaries, and here looking at internal respiration, the movement of the gases between the tissue cells and systemic capillaries. Very important information to review for sure. Here we have a video that you're more than welcome to take a look at. So I'm sure you looked at the first part of the video in the respiratory physiology slides, part 1, which the emphasis was kind of on Boyle's law and understanding inhalation, exhalation of the diaphragm, rib cage, and external intercostal muscles. The second half of this video focuses on the methods and how oxygen and carbon dioxide gas are moving through the body. So I strongly recommend for you to take a look at this video, as it may help you with a further understanding. All right, we've talked a lot about breathing and a lot of physiology involved. But ultimately, where is this breathing controlled? What sets up breathing patterns throughout our body? So that's what we got to take a look at next. So breathing ultimately is controlled up in the brain, in the brainstem. And in the brainstem, we have what are these structures called the pons and the medulla oblongata. The pons and the medulla oblongata ultimately control the respiratory rate and the depth of our breathing. Okay? And we'll find several different structures that are found up in the pons and the medulla oblongata. So up in the pons, we have what's known as the pontine respiratory centers. And ultimately, this structure modifies breathing rhythm activity. And this will help to smooth the respiratory pattern of our breathing. So, such as when you're sleeping. A little farther down, because then you have messages that can be sent from the pons, from the pontine respiratory center, down to the medulla oblongata. And you have two major respiratory groups here we're going to talk about here real soon. The ventral respiratory group, the VRG, so ventral in the front of the medulla oblongata. And then also the dorsal respiratory group, the DRG, which is found in the back of the medulla oblongata. So, the ventral respiratory group is important for setting up the normal respiratory rate and rhythm of breathing. It's considered to be your rhythm generating integrative center. So pretty important, a lot of important properties and duties here. The dorsal respiratory group in the back of the medulla oblongata will integrate peripheral sensory input and modify the rhythms of breathing. All right, so when we look at these two groups, the one that I feel is really important to focus in on to understand is going to be that ventral respiratory group. The ventral respiratory group is right here. So I'm kind of drawing on it right here, right in the front of the medulla oblongata. This group is going to send information away, okay, through neurons, through inspiratory neurons, when we're thinking of inhalation, and messages sent away from this structure through neurons, ultimately connecting up with two major important nerves. And these nerves here are the pheneric nerve and the intercostal nerves. So these are very important nerves. We think of peripheral nerves, and the pheneric nerve is ultimately going to be sending messages to the diaphragm. So that way the diaphragm can be utilized for breathing when you're undergoing inhalation, right? Or when you're undergoing exhalation. So that's going to be the work of the pheneric nerve, okay? The pheneric nerve is connected to the diaphragm and sends signals to the diaphragm to be utilized for breathing purposes. So that is the pheneric nerve. Okay? And then the other critical nerve to know are the intercostal nerves. The intercostal nerves. So these intercostal nerves make sense that they are sending messages ultimately to the external intercostal muscles. So intercostal nerve sending messages to the external intercostal muscles so that way they can be utilized for breathing, for inhalation, exhalation. And of course, these are undergoing contractions with the inhalation and relaxing during the exhalation. Okay? So external intercostal muscles are connected to the intercostal nerve. And again, these muscles are undergoing contractions during inhalation. They're relaxing during the exhale. And then the pheneric nerve is connected to your diaphragm. So that way the diaphragm is being utilized during breathing, during inhalation or exhalation. Okay? So very important to review this information here. We now take a look at factors which are going to influence your breathing rate and depth. And so that gets us to looking at what are known as chemoreceptors. Chemoreceptors. So chemoreceptors are sensors which respond to chemical fluctuations. And so that can be fluctuations of the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in your arterial blood, the levels of oxygen in the arterial blood, the partial pressure again, and the level of hydrogen ions. And that's referring to what is your pH in arterial blood. Is it going up? Is it going down? So chemoreceptors can sense these changes. Where do we find the chemoreceptors in our body? So there's two major locations. One is the central chemoreceptors. Central chemoreceptors. They are going to be found in the brainstem. So that's where you find the central chemoreceptors, the brainstem of the body. So referring to the pons, the medulla oblongata. And then we also have what are known as peripheral chemoreceptors, and they're located at the top of the aorta, at the aortic arch, and also the carotid arteries. Okay, the carotid arteries. So in very close proximity, when we think of kind of the end of the common carotid artery and the start of the external and internal carotid arteries. So we can kind of see that here in the diagram. Okay, so peripheral chemoreceptors in close proximity to the carotid arteries. So again, here's the that common carotid artery right here. And then up here, of course, you have your external and internal carotid artery over here. This referring to the peripheral chemoreceptor. And then the aortic arch, aortic bodies here. So that's where we have our other peripheral chemoreceptor. All right. We're now going to take a look at neural and chemical influences on the brainstem respiratory centers. So there's going to be influences that can increase our breathing or decrease it, inhibit it. A positive mark shows excitatory influences that would increase the respiratory rate of breathing, while a negative sign indicates inhibitory influences on breathing. So we look at some of these. Here, peripheral chemoreceptors can be a positive influence here in certain situations. Likewise, central chemoreceptors. Better examples of this can be affect exercise, right? When you're exercising, you have receptors in those skeletal muscles and joints. Ultimately, that can lead to an increase in your breathing rate. And that makes sense. When you're doing aerobic exercise, ultimately respiratory rate is going to go up. And this is through the effect of these receptors that allow that to be so. And what's interesting too, the way your body is programmed is when you have a big event coming, you have a big triathlon coming, a big canoe race, kayak race, running race, whatever it might be, is even just an hour or so before the event, your respiratory rate is already starting to go up a little bit. Your body is anticipating the amount of work it has to do. And these messages are going back and forth between the brain and the muscles preparing that. So quite interesting. So that's a positive stimulation. A negative stimulation here would be the effect of being exposed to irritant receptors. Okay? Exposure to irritant receptors. So maybe it's dust that you're experiencing. You're breathing it in. You're working in the crawl space. You're putting new insulation in. Okay? And that might be affecting your breathing, potentially. Another type of negative influence that we can see here, with the negative sign, are stretch receptors in the lungs. And these are kind of a special evolutionary feature so you don't hyperinflate your lungs. If you're doing really strong breathing, exercising, or a deep breath maybe before going down to snorkel in the pool or whatever it might be. This unique evolutionary feature that we have is known as the hearing-Brunner reflex. The hearing-Brunner reflex. And this was developed from a German respiratory physiologist, Hearing-Brunner. And this reflects, again, evolutionary feature which prevents excessive stretching of the lungs in the situation of hyperinflation. It's kind of a protective type of mechanism that we have. So that can be a big role player there. Other things that can influence your breathing rates can be emotional stimuli. So based off of emotions or fears, that can definitely play a big role with potentially impacting breathing, respiratory rate maybe going up, going down, depending upon the situation. So those are other ones as well. And of course, this is working through the hypothalamus here. So those are some examples that you can see. Holding a breath can definitely play a role with changes in respiratory rate of breathing too. So, all right, so hyperventilation. We've talked about this a little bit, and here we're going to look at it again. So when we look at hyperventilation, that's when there's an increase in the depth of your breathing, the overall rate, respiratory rate, that exceeds the body's need to remove carbon dioxide gas, because your exhalation is very, very fast, and that's faster than the inhalation. The case with someone having an anxiety attack. This is also known as respiratory alkalosis, when someone is experiencing hyperventilation. So the blood pH is going to increase, become more basic or alkaline, and the partial pressure of CO2 will fall. So the amount of CO2 in the body falls because of the effect that you're releasing so much CO2 during the exhale portion of breathing. An old-fashioned remedy sometimes that can help some people to really trick the brain is sometimes simply breathing into a good old paper bag, and that can help to calm someone, eventually get that breathing rate down to normal. So for example, some people are afraid to fly. They're always afraid the plane's going to crash. Oh my gosh, right? And maybe that vomit bag is in front of you, and you can open that up and breathe into that. Maybe you have a paper bag from lunch you bought in the airport, and maybe just breathing into that can help to calm the nerves some. All right, we're now going to take a look at the pathogenesis of COPD. And COPD is an abbreviation for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. This can come about through air pollution. So maybe there's a factory nearby that's releasing lots of pollutants. And also from tobacco smoke. So someone who's smoking lots of cigarettes, cigars, pipes, right? And there's also studies out there now that smoking lots of marijuana can lead to COPD. So that's another possibility to consider. And over time, then, this can lead to either emphysema, chronic bronchitis. It can lead to one, or it can lead to both. The chronic bronchitis typically is the increase of the edema, a cough that can occur. The emphysema is the overall destruction of the alveolar walls. So it makes it more difficult for gas exchange to occur, right, from the alveolus to the pulmonary capillaries. Over time, this can lead to very labored breathing, known as dyspnea, and eventually respiratory failure, hypoventilation. Obviously, definitely not a win-win situation here. Another thing to look at, of course, is lung cancer. And lung cancer statistically accounts for 90% of all cases are the result of smoking. Okay? So 90% of all cases of lung cancer is the result of smoking, especially from smoking cigarettes. The number one killer of cancer in North America is lung cancer, when we look at Canada and especially, of course, the United States. These pictures here show someone who has donated their heart, their lungs, essentially their body to science. So here we have a picture of a non-smoker's lungs, looking very healthy. Everything's looking wonderful, right? Nice and peachy. Very nice tissue. And then the other picture that you can see here is the smoker. And very different here. The smoker's lungs, charred, completely charred because of decades and decades of smoking cigarettes. So, very sad. No benefits to smoking, so don't smoke. Okay, we're now going to review. So here's our first review question for the second part of our respiratory physiology. So number 6, internal respiration takes place between blank. Internal respiration takes place between blank. So what would be the correct answer here? What would be the correct answer here? Okay, and the correct answer, when we're thinking of internal respiration, I would probably go with choice letter B. So letter B is the correct answer. Tissues and systemic capillaries. That's the correct answer. So that's the case with internal respiration. If we were talking about external respiration, then the correct answer for that would be choice letter A, the alveolus and pulmonary capillaries. But this question is referring to internal respiration. Number 7 for review. What percentage of carbon dioxide gas is transported as bicarbonate ions in the blood plasma? So, what would be the correct answer here? What would you go with? What would be the correct answer here? All right. And the correct answer, I would go with choice letter C, 70%. So 70% of CO2, carbon dioxide gas, will be transported as bicarbonate in the blood plasma. So letter C is the correct answer. Number 8, what percentage of oxygen is loosely bound to hemoglobin? What percentage of oxygen is loosely bounded to hemoglobin? All right. And the correct answer that I would go with would be choice letter D. 98.5% would be the correct answer. Number 9. Chemoreceptors, such as the peripheral and central, are sensors responding to chemical fluctuations in blank in arterial blood. So, what would be the correct answer for this question? All right. And the correct answer that I would go with would be choice letter E. Both A, B, and C would be correct, referring to oxygen, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen ion levels. All right, number 10. So now this is a review of our histology here, because this is obviously always important to know your histology when it comes to practicals. So, based on the above image, the lung pathology shown here is called the what? Again, based on the above image, the lung pathology shown here is called the what? And the correct answer that I would go with, how about choice letter C, emphysema? So emphysema would be the correct answer. We know that to be true because you have all of this dead space, and we'll fix this here real quick. you have all of this dead space right here where you had a lot of alveoli that were destroyed. You've lost surface area. And so that's going to play a major role when you're identifying this histology, when you're trying to identify this disease. Number 11 for review. Based on the above image, the lung pathology shown here would be called what? So what would be the correct answer here? All right. And the correct answer that I would go with, how about letter B? Black lung disease. Black lung disease. So that's the correct answer here. And you know that to be true because all of the black carbon here, all that carbon buildup is a big clue that yes, this is black lung disease. So that's the common name. There's other common names for this too, such as smoker's lung disease or coal miner's lung disease. So several different common names here. All right, number 12 for review. Based on the above image, the lung pathology shown here is called the what? So what would be the correct answer here? All right, so the correct answer that I would go with, how about choice letter A? Choice letter A, lung cancer. So we can see that on here. This is a big tumor right here, okay? So if you see a tumor on the slide, we're definitely looking at lung cancer or lung carcinoma. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed today's lecture. It's amazing how much we've learned through the respiratory system and respiratory physiology. And I hope you had a great day.